To explain why finance is a product of geopolitical order, we must begin with history. Modern finance emerged in the wake of World War I and World War II, and it's been shaped by the dominance of the United States ever since. But when global order shifts, especially through war, the financial order inevitably shifts along with it. We can't claim to predict such changes with certainty, but if we trace the arc of history, we begin to sense when deep shifts are already underway. Now, we must frame these changes through Bitcoin and blockchain. Up to now, I've barely mentioned either, but from this point on, Bitcoin will take center stage. Today's lecture might be a bit of a headache, fair warning. Not long ago, the governor of Gangwon province in Korea refused to guarantee the debts of Legoland, and that decision sent a cold shock through the bond market. We're talking about regular corporate bonds. In finance, we measure them against 3-year government bonds, and the difference is called the spread. We use basis points. 100 basis points equals 1%. At one point, the spread was 60.8 basis points. Later, it widened to 120.2 basis points. Finance needs an anchor, some point of reference. I've called this the gravitational center of finance. Once you fix that center, everything else becomes easier to calculate. But fundamentally, why this interest rate? Without meaning, it would just be a string of random numbers. For the borrower and the lender to agree on a rate, they both need to believe in the same benchmark. Because there's no universal correct rate, we settle on a convention. In countries like Korea, the 3-year government bond usually acts as that benchmark. In rare cases, a company might be more trusted than the government itself. But that's the exception, not the rule. Even Samsung Electronics, its bonds carry a wider spread than the Korean government's treasury bonds. That spread is the market's way of pricing in risk. Which brings us to a deeper question. What is the global benchmark? Let's be honest, Korea isn't setting that benchmark. Last time I mentioned the overnight lending rates between major global banks centered in the city of London. It started as an overnight rate, but evolved into 3- and 6-month terms. And that rate is published daily at 11 a.m. London time. They announce it, and it's called LIBOR. The London Interbank Offered Rate, LIBOR. So how did LIBOR come to hold such global authority? It traces back to the rise of the euro-dollar market in the 1950s and 60s, and later, a flood of oil money surged in, seeking places to flow and recycle. When OPEC weaponized oil and sent prices soaring, a vast amount of dollars ended up concentrated in the hands of Middle Eastern elites and governments. So what did they do with all that money? Some of it was used for consumer imports or shared with their people, but the rest, they deposited it in the City of London. And bankers in the City of London, they lent that money to countries like Brazil and Argentina. That's how capital was recycled. And through that culture of recycling, LIBOR became the benchmark, even for Korean bonds. Korean companies peg their borrowing to Korean treasury bonds, right? Then what anchors those treasury yields? It's LIBOR. LIBOR is the deeper benchmark. This is the architecture of modern finance. Most Koreans don't know this. It's rarely discussed, even in the press. Rates derived from LIBOR became the reference for over $350 trillion in financial contracts worldwide. Some of our own intellectuals, unfamiliar with finance, think the US Fed's interest rate announcement defines everything. But that's not the full picture. At least it wasn't in the past. What happens next? Well, that's still unfolding. When London takes a day off, LIBOR pauses. London is the clock, no publication on British holidays. Now, recently, the UK appointed a Prime Minister of Indian descent. He checks every box, young, good-looking. Oh, and his in-laws, they run Infosys. You know Infosys? It's a global IT giant founded in India. Yeah, his wife's family is Infosys. He's British, but his wife isn't even a UK citizen. Isn't that remarkable? That's Britain. Apparently, even the First Lady doesn't have to be British. So, yes, he's now Prime Minister. But earlier this year, when he was still Chancellor, he declared that the UK would become a global crypto hub. By crypto, he meant what we call virtual assets, digital currencies. In English, it's always been crypto. That's why I don't like the vague term virtual asset. Let's just call it what it is, crypto. So the UK wants to lead the crypto revolution, but you have to see that in the broader historical context. Britain has always fought to maintain its dominance in global finance. That's actually one of the key themes of today's lecture. Not every Brit feels this way, of course. But just as English is their native language, finance is almost second nature. Not quite as much as English, but finance still feels like theirs. It's like they carry a finance gene. They know they can't win with aircraft carriers or brute strength, not against the US, obviously, and even China outpaces them in many ways. But in finance, we still lead. That's the belief. I first discovered Bitcoin in February 2014. Then around July or August, the UK Chancellor at the time, George Osborne, yes, this was 2014, back when most people in Korea hadn't even heard of Bitcoin. The UK's Chancellor publicly announced plans to seriously explore cryptocurrencies, saying the UK couldn't afford to fall behind on emerging technologies. As a symbolic gesture, he even bought Bitcoin from an ATM in London that very day. The Financial Times made fun of it, saying the price crashed right after his purchase. They even published cartoons mocking him. A finance minister buys Bitcoin and the price drops. Pretty ironic, isn't it? Back then, I didn't know any of this. I had studied business and economics, but geopolitics, I knew absolutely nothing. I was so deeply shaped by business and economics that I couldn't see past it. I thought climate and geography were outdated, irrelevant theories. I visited Shanghai once and it was brutally hot. Despite the heat, the economy was booming. So I concluded naively that climate doesn't matter for economic growth. But ignorance has a price. It was through studying Bitcoin that I realized how disconnected I was from people with the same academic background. It felt like we spoke entirely different languages. And I started asking myself, these are smart people, but why are they so blind to this? It sounds contradictory, but in the case of Bitcoin, it's absolutely true. That dissonance between intelligence and blindness is what opened my eyes to geopolitics. And now, when I look at how London or Britain behaves, I can interpret just a scrap of a photo or headline and unpack it for you. But the way I interpret it now is entirely different from how a conventional economist would. We're here to study the historical weight embedded in that one image. Why is Britain positioning itself this way? Think back to 2014. Had you even heard of Bitcoin? But at that time, the UK's Chancellor was already staging a symbolic act. He bought Bitcoin from an ATM in London. And he declared London will lead the future of financial innovation. That same man who once vowed to make Britain a crypto hub, the UK calls its finance minister Chancellor, a term that in Germany actually refers to the head of state, which tells you the Chancellor in the UK is often a prime minister in waiting. If not the next PM, then perhaps the one after that. Not always, of course. But even Churchill served as Chancellor before becoming prime minister. So this former Chancellor who once promised a crypto hub for the UK is now the prime minister. Of course, what a PM does isn't always a continuation of their past office. The position comes with broader political calculations. But here's the question I want us to ask today. In Korea, corporate bonds are priced relative to government bonds. And it's not just interpretation, that's how the math actually works. Government bonds are considered almost risk-free. So we measure how much additional risk a corporate bond carries, hence the spread. Well, what is the anchor for our government bonds? It's LIBOR. From the 1970s through the 2010s, that's how it's been. LIBOR was the benchmark, and it was set by bankers in London. Isn't it curious how London is behaving like this? And there's Hong Kong too, don't forget. Last time I spoke about Eurodollars and clarified that Eurodollars are neither euros nor literally dollars from Europe. But I said their spiritual home is the City of London. What's the technical term for this kind of money like Eurodollars? It's called offshore finance, correct? And what's the offshore hub of Asia? Offshore finance means depositing not your own country's currency, but another country's money into a bank outside that issuing country, so that it's free from the regulations of both the source country and the host. To simplify, if you deposit yen, but the bank isn't in Japan, then you're outside the reach of both the Bank of Japan and local regulators. If you save dollars inside the US, you're constantly under the Fed's oversight. You need to deposit reserves with the Fed, comply with deposit insurance, and so on. None of that applies offshore. Offshore finance means escaping those regulatory layers. So where's Asia's offshore financial hub? It's none other than Hong Kong. It was a major financial hub. Why? Because it was created structurally by Britain. It inherited Britain's financial gene. It's in the DNA. So they speak English and they do finance. But now Hong Kong has been absorbed into China. Remember, before COVID, Hong Kong endured over a year of protests. And then it all vanished, just like that. And that wasn't the only time. Protests have been recurring because China keeps passing laws that chip away at Hong Kong's autonomy. There were major protests in 2007, again in 2010. In any case, Hong Kong just isn't what it used to be for many reasons. And one big reason is this: China no longer needs Hong Kong like it once did. Hong Kong used to be China's gateway for attracting foreign capital. Even today, but especially in the early days of reform, China was an extremely closed society. So allowing capital inflow meant giving up a degree of sovereign control. If China had told foreign firms, come in, but we'll regulate you just like we do our citizens, no one would have come. That's the reality. Capital always rides in on the back of freedom. Since liberalizing all of China wasn't feasible, they experimented through Hong Kong and Shenzhen. Hong Kong became a critical gateway where Chinese firms could even list abroad via indirect channels. So in many ways, Hong Kong citizens enjoyed more freedom than even Koreans did. Especially when it came to the press, they had near absolute freedom. But the trigger for the most recent protests, a book, whether tabloid or true, touched on Xi Jinping's alleged affairs. The Hong Kong bookseller who sold it simply disappeared. He reappeared in mainland China on trial. That shocked Hong Kong society to its core. He was abducted in Hong Kong, tried in China. That's what sparked the mass protests. And now that same Hong Kong, even as China maintains a hostile stance toward Bitcoin, we're starting to see different signals from Hong Kong. According to Bloomberg, a bill is expected in March 2023, suggesting that Hong Kong may reopen Bitcoin trading to retail investors. Of course, Hong Kong is caught in a dilemma. Whether Beijing will allow it remains uncertain. But the important point is this. Former offshore financial hubs are now showing real interest in Bitcoin. Doesn't that seem like a reasonable inference? Maybe offshore finance and Bitcoin share a kind of DNA. You've probably heard this before. Debates over whether Bitcoin will replace the dollar as base money. That's never really interested me. Why? Because I've studied offshore finance. I know what that system means. It's powerful, it's massive, and it's hidden in plain sight. So let's get back to LIBOR. LIBOR is now being dismantled. The US Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and the OCC, a US regulatory body with growing relevance to Bitcoin, ordered all new financial contracts using LIBOR to cease by the end of 2021. Of course, this applies to every financial institution operating in the US, which effectively means the whole global financial system. Sure, LIBOR is still being published for now, but it's no longer to be used as the basis for new contracts. Why is this happening? What's the full story? After the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008, during the Wall Street meltdown, the world realized even banks could fail. LIBOR is based on interbank lending, banks lending to each other. LIBOR is based on interbank lending, banks lending to each other. But in a crisis, those loans freeze, banks stop trusting banks, LIBOR rates spike, the system jams, it stops functioning. Meanwhile, if the US wants to stabilize global markets, it needs to inject liquidity, print money. But LIBOR, it lies outside American jurisdiction. And yet the warning sirens kept sounding from LIBOR. Another issue, LIBOR isn't a purely free market rate. It's a private club, a circle of bankers, which makes it vulnerable to manipulation. Think about it. This is why Bitcoin's decentralization really matters. We're talking about just 7 banks, 7. In theory, they're London banks, but it's just 7 institutions. When those 7 set interest rates, even the tiniest decimal point move up or down can change the value and interest payouts of massive bond portfolios, especially for floating rate instruments. And when spreads are layered on top of spreads, the volatility is huge, right? Along the way, there were whistleblowers. Of course, the US investigated. They probably went in together forcefully. It became a full-blown scandal. There's a whole paper trail. It surely wasn't just this once. So here's how I interpret it. Until Bitcoin emerged, what we saw globally was this: a tightening crackdown on offshore finance, led by the US. Offshore finance has been steadily losing room to operate. The official rationale, money laundering through offshore accounts. Have you heard this before? Giant multinationals like Google aren't technically American companies. They set up headquarters in island nations and pay almost no tax. You've heard that, right? It's in the papers all the time. Not always, but in most cases, those places are British territories. And Britain is America's ally, right? They're a military ally willing to follow America into war. But these financial havens, they bother the US deeply. The US isn't an empire. It can't impose its sovereignty on British territory. Sure, it can apply political pressure, but globally, there are many such financial havens, what we call tax havens. It doesn't matter much to us. We don't have that kind of tax burden. Places like the Cayman Islands are scattered around the Caribbean, North Africa, the Mediterranean, and most of them were former British colonies. So officially, their king is still the British monarch, The monarch never visits, they elect their own governors and operate autonomously. Multinational corporations place their HQs there and avoid taxes. So the US has crafted strategies to squeeze and shut them down. That's the official justification. Anyway, offshore finance is losing its room to maneuver. And big banks kept causing trouble, playing games with LIBOR rates. It seems like the US wants to take control away from them. The cutoff was December 2021, so starting in 2022, LIBOR can't be used. But to prepare for that, banks needed massive restructuring. LIBOR underpinned global finance and every major asset, so the shift was huge. But just then COVID hit, so banks didn't finish preparing in time. And that's why the transition period keeps getting delayed. So whether the Fed's desired path, replacing LIBOR with US Fed rates, will truly happen, or whether LIBOR survives by market inertia, we don't know yet. I'm not sure, but either way, it's officially banned. So what's the alternative? This is it. This too is something you really need to study today. Feels like the difficulty just jumped, right? We went from talking about the three kingdoms. But once you get this, your perspective broadens dramatically. So make sure you study this. It's called SOFR. I'm not even sure how to pronounce it properly. It stands for Secured Overnight Financing Rate. Emphasis on secured. Here's one important thing we learned from that. Was LIBOR secured or not? I briefly mentioned this at the end of the last session. LIBOR was not secured, no guarantees. The US even created a dedicated committee to recommend alternatives. They formed a panel to decide what rate should replace LIBOR. That's where SOFR came from. It doesn't refer to a specific product. It's a basket of instruments, but collectively we call it SOFR. LIBOR was unsecured, no collateral involved, but SOFR is secured. So what backs it? The ban is specifically on LIBOR denominated in dollars because it's under US jurisdiction. The US can't tell the world to stop using LIBOR in yen. Yen isn't theirs to regulate, right? So LIBOR still exists. It's published in yen, yuan, and Swiss francs. But dollar LIBOR is what they're telling us not to use. Global reinsurers and many institutions still use LIBOR for interest calculations, but now they're told to stop. So they build something else. That's SOFR. Then what collateral backs SOFR? Even for overnight lending, it requires collateral. Why would I trust you even for one night? In interbank lending, there used to be no collateral. It was like, hey, we trust each other, don't we? We've been conditioned to see imperialism as inherently evil. Have you ever heard anyone talk about the merits of imperialism? Even with all its evils, has anyone ever said this part was actually good? It's kind of like aristocracy. We live in a democracy now. But aristocracy, people used to say, well, this part of it was noble. Have you ever learned about that side of it? Here's what we learned from this. We are a completely different species from our Joseon-era scholar ancestors. The worldview of people who lived here 150 years ago, and for 600 years before that, would be completely baffled by the things we take for granted. If we read what they believed, we'd probably feel sick to our stomachs. Especially their views on women and commoners, we'd be horrified. The idea that all people are equal, that's our ideal. And the belief that each nation exercises its own sovereignty to shape its people's future, that's an ideal too. But in reality, these are lies. They are lies we dignify as ideals. We are a generation raised within these two beautiful lies, that aristocracy is bad and imperialism is bad. But today, I want to give you a different frame to think about, even though we're talking about finance. Some of you are coders thinking, what does this have to do with me? But this is crucial. Even people working at banks in our country don't know what I'm telling you now. In other context, you believe that every life has equal value and that people deserve equal treatment. But no matter how egalitarian you are, I'm sure of this. There's a moment when none of us are true egalitarians when it comes to lending money. Can you honestly lend to everyone at the same interest rate? For 40 or 50 years, 7 banks in the City of London set the baseline interest rates for nearly all financial assets worldwide. Why? Because in the world of finance, they were the aristocracy. They didn't default, they didn't declare bankruptcy. They got the money collateral free because of who they were. So could our Korean banks have joined that circle of 7? No, they couldn't. That's the essence of aristocracy. It's not just about power or wealth. You had to be born into it. Your parents had to be aristocrats. New money could never catch up, right? Finance at its core is aristocratic. And deep down, we all know that. When you apply democratic ideals to finance, the system breaks. The subprime mortgage crisis, it was democracy gone mad. Starting with President Clinton's vision that every American should own a home. They created state-backed firms like Freddie Mac and handed out massive subsidies and financial perks for home buyers. That was subprime. People with regular income like us were considered prime. Those with little or unstable income, subprime. So I guess that makes me subprime too. They let subprime borrowers buy homes with leverage, and after 15 years, the system collapsed. Finance doesn't work on democracy, no matter what ideals you hold in your head. Do you trust all people equally? Can you really? Would you lend your own money to everyone equally? Today, I'm suggesting this. One reason why humanity preserved aristocracy and imperialism for so long was because of finance. I'm proposing a hypothesis for you to consider. If we didn't need finance to survive, maybe this wouldn't matter. But if finance is as essential as air, water, or electricity to our civilization, then maybe it's finance that makes empire necessary and hierarchy inevitable. That's the hypothesis I'm sharing with you today. This is the underlying theme of today's lecture. It shapes the way we interpret what's happening, like what the US is really doing. LIBOR represents aristocracy. SOFR is the American bureaucratic alternative. They say it's risk-free. So what's the collateral US Treasury bonds? This kind of overnight lending is called a repurchase agreement. You should remember this term. It's called a repo. It stands for repurchase agreement, but I'm still not sure why it became repo, not repa. It really should be repa, since it comes from repurchase agreement. It's a conditional agreement. I'll buy it back. Here's how it works. US Treasuries are considered safe assets. Say I'm holding a Treasury bond. I ask, do you have cash? Take my Treasury as collateral and lend me money just for one night. I actually want to keep this bond. So I'll buy it back tomorrow at a slightly higher price. What I just described is called a reverse repo. It's essentially the same thing. From the lender's point of view, this is how a repo works. Let's say I have money, I'm Microsoft. I've got $1 billion I won't be using overnight. If I leave it idle, it's just $1 billion. But if I lend it overnight, I can earn a few million. So I lend it out overnight. But the borrower isn't aristocracy. They might run, so I need collateral. I ask, what do you have as collateral? They say a Treasury bond. Great, give it to me and I'll lend you $1 billion. You buy the bond back tomorrow. That's a repo. Now you might wonder why go through all this trouble overnight. Why bother with these just for one night, right? First of all, who uses reverse repos the most? The Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States. They are the biggest player in reverse repo operations. It's called the RRP, Reverse Repurchase Program. So when does the Fed use reverse repos? When the market needs liquidity. They take treasuries from commercial banks overnight and inject cash. Then they hold on to the bonds for a week or a month before pulling the money back and returning the bonds. That's when they use reverse repos. And other players use it too. It's even used in the private sector. People looking to short treasury bonds or similar securities use it. Overnight is just an extreme example. If you expect prices to fall, you sell now. Then buy it back later, cheaper. That's a short. Companies with massive cash reserves, lots of liquidity, might be holding money they owe to a buyer. But the contract says they don't need to pay until the end of the month. But the money already came in from a seller. They don't want to pay it out just yet. So instead, they park it overnight and earn interest. Here's the key point. The US Federal Reserve legally requires commercial banks to keep a certain reserve ratio deposited with the central bank. It's mandatory. Let's quickly review, even though it's basic. Why must banks hold back part of their capital instead of lending it all out? To prevent bank runs, exactly. To avoid a run, banks don't lend out 100% of deposits. We've covered all of this before. They hold a portion with the central bank instead. That held portion represents opportunity cost. They could have earned interest on it, but they don't. So they try to minimize that, but sometimes cross the red line. Then the Fed hits them with a penalty for the shortfall. And that fine is expensive, so it's cheaper to use a repo instead, as long as the repo rate is lower than the fine. That's why overnight repo markets are massive. We're talking trillions of dollars changing hands every night. SOFR is essentially built by aggregating a variety of these repo transactions. Some of those repos are more influential than others. They bundled them together to form SOFR and told us to use it as a benchmark rate. That's America's official recommendation, whereas LIBOR came from the City of London. The financial distinction may not matter to us, but geopolitically it's huge. Geopolitically, it's about the fortress of offshore finance that London built and how US repo operations pull that influence under Federal Reserve control. Because what's the underlying collateral? US Treasury bonds. So part of the financial dominance that once belonged to Britain, it feels like the US is pulling it back into its own domain. It may sound like a conspiracy theory, but the picture is pretty clear. So what's Britain's alternative? Bitcoin, that's it. Since Bitcoin is so volatile, people still ask, how can it possibly replace the dollar? That's why you need to understand finance. Bitcoin is actually an ideal collateral asset for repos, even better than US treasuries for one specific reason. Can you guess what it is? Bitcoin is better collateral than treasuries for repo purposes. For one key reason, just one. Everything else is worse, but this one thing makes it special. Nothing beats Bitcoin as an overnight or 1 week collateral asset. They call it risk-free, but that's not really true. It's not risk-free because the collateral often doesn't even move. It's all on paper, just contractual, because it's based on trust between counterparties. It's a financial aristocracy, and we're not invited in. They call it a democracy, but it's not. This whole thing is run by financial aristocrats. LIBOR was run by the true aristocrats, the 7 legacy banking families. SOFR is controlled by a newer class, the powerful financial nobility. Can we get into this game? The stakes are astronomical. US treasuries carry trust, and these insiders trust one another completely. So they don't even move the collateral. Why bother? They just write the contract and pretend. But what happens if something really goes wrong? When banks actually failed, LIBOR couldn't even be published. Banks couldn't lend to one another. That kind of collapse could happen again. Turns out the treasury bond was never moved. The money transferred, but the bond stayed with the counterparty. Bitcoin, it settles instantly, sent and received without delay. What I'm saying now, no one in the mainstream finance world is talking about it. Bitcoin is the best overnight collateral asset in the world. And overnight finance is the gravitational center of global finance. Therefore, Bitcoin could become the backbone of the world's credit network. Not yet, but you'll witness it in your lifetime. Isn't it incredible? It just moves instantly. Remember, we're talking overnight finance. You might say Bitcoin's price is too volatile, but in a single night, it rarely changes that much. Now you can see why I explain finance this way. Finance isn't really about year-long home loans like most people think. The engine of finance is short-term lending within ultra-trusted inner circles among players who circulate enormous volumes of capital. Rates are determined over 1 night, 1 week, at most 3 months. And then players like us borrow at rates tied to them. Say a lender like Russian Cash gives you a loan. Then how do they get the money? They get it from markets like LIBOR through 1 or 2 layers. Yeah, through 2 intermediaries. Because banks never lend their own money. Let's say I have credit, I trust this borrower, and I'm confident I'll be paid back. LIBOR is 3% and I can lend at 10%. If nothing goes wrong, I pocket the 7% spread. That's what finance is. You might say, but this loan is for a year and this repo is only a week. You fools, it's rolled over weekly. That's how it works. That's the nature of finance. So once you get into that inner circle, unless you totally screw up, you just make money, massive money. The problem, you're not invited in. So will we keep using LIBOR, controlled by the 7 traditional banking houses, or will we shift to SOFR, the system backed by the US government and the Fed? That's the battle underway. Have you ever heard this explained anywhere else? Do you see this kind of story in the Korean press? This is a major conflict, even among allies. SOFR has overnight rates and 30-day rates. LIBOR has 1 week, 1 month, and 3-month maturities. They don't match up perfectly, term by term. But since SOFR is based on risk-free assets and not tied to bank credit, it usually has a lower rate. LIBOR is higher, but interestingly, I found that SOFR is more volatile. Its standard deviation is larger. Criticism of SOFR is starting to emerge, most likely from scholars backed by or sympathetic to the UK. Now let's circle back. What did the US gain from World War I? European demand for American raw materials and essentials surged. At the time, the UK and France were borrowing hundreds of millions of dollars each year to buy American goods. America participated in the war in 2 ways, sending troops and also serving as a logistical base, supplying weapons and materials to its allies. And all of that was on credit, loans. Before the war, the US GDP was $40 billion. It rose to $60 billion. Its gold reserves rose to $4 billion. More gold meant more dollars in circulation. Back then, the dollar was quasi-gold-backed. Of course, during the war, convertibility was suspended. America doubled its money supply, but how it happened was totally different from Britain and France. The US expanded its money supply through real exports and inbound payments. Britain and France just printed money to pay for the war. The US committed $30 billion to the war, with $20 billion in actual costs and $10 billion in foreign loans. So yes, the US spent $20 billion. But the way America sold bonds differed from Europe. In the US, the Federal Reserve didn't buy bonds directly, meaning the Fed didn't directly buy Treasury securities. Only in extreme cases does the Fed step in and buy Treasuries. In even worse situations, the Fed starts buying corporate bonds. During COVID, I believe the Fed did all of that. Europe, by contrast, just printed bonds and told their central banks, you take this first. The central bank would print money and then sort things out later. The US never did it that way. America used the open market and commercial banks. So in the end, it was American patriots, the citizens, who held those bonds. In short, the US had a sense of civic duty in finance, and the wealthy, even if they didn't fight, opened their wallets and paid their way into the war effort. Europe, in desperation, just printed their way through. That was the key difference. America didn't collapse socially because of it. Do you remember Woodrow Wilson? His vision was called Wilsonian idealism. At the time, the US president was the idealist Wilson. This period between World War I and II is known as the interwar era. History books about that period may not talk about Wilson explicitly, but when they talk about America, it's really about Wilson. There's a view that if America had acted more wisely, World War II might have been avoided. After the war, every European country borrowed money wherever they could. Germany had no allies to borrow from, so its money supply grew 4 or 6-fold. Britain and France saw a 2 or 3-fold increase. That's how important alliances are. That's why I brought up China, because it has no real allies. No nation on earth can match China in size and stand beside it. Russia may be vast in territory, but its GDP is about the same as Korea's. When oil prices rise, they get ahead of us. But when semiconductors go up, we take the lead. China has no allies even remotely comparable in scale, but the US, it's surrounded by powerful allies. That's a huge difference. During World War I, Britain and France owed the United States several $billion. Britain, meanwhile, held substantial loans across 17 countries. You could say Britain borrowed from the US and passed the money on to its allies in Europe. So Russia and France could do the fighting. They were fighting on Britain's behalf. Now here's how the mental math worked for Britain and France. They needed war reparations from Germany and wanted to link that to the debt they owed the US. They looked to Germany for cash, but stared longingly at Washington. And American officials would say, hey, maybe ease up on Germany, they lost the war, they're struggling. If you push too hard, it's cruel, they'd tell France. And France would say, but I have to pay back Britain. I need German money to repay my British debt. And Britain would say, and I need that money to repay America. It all boiled down to, if America forgives us, we'll forgive Germany. But Americans have a very distinct mindset. We saw it too during Korea's IMF crisis. They made a hard distinction. A contract is a contract and aid is aid. Their response, that was a contract. In 2006, Britain held a small ceremony. Here's what that event was. They paid off their final World War II debt to the United States. Pretty amazing, right? Even as a close ally, Britain paid every penny and held a ceremony to say, it's done. Yes, America launched the Marshall Plan to keep Western Europe from collapsing. We've studied that. But in the American mind, aid is aid and debt must be repaid. They said, pay it back, and so Britain did. Back then, Britain owed the US more than its own GDP. Of course, with decades of growth and inflation, it became symbolic. In real terms, it was almost like not paying at all. They repaid the bonds at face value, but the bonds were worth pennies. Still, the American mentality was, pay the debt, we'll extend the deadline, but you must pay, it's a legal obligation. Aid is compassion, debt is commerce, different things. Europeans, meanwhile, didn't understand this mindset at all. They were like, what the hell is wrong with the Americans? Yeah, if you forgive our debt, we'll go easy on Germany, they said. That's when the brilliant John Maynard Keynes came up with a bold idea. He pitched it to Neville Chamberlain, then Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer, who later became Prime Minister right before World War II. He struck the Munich Agreement with Hitler, his last naive hope for peace. And that was the end of his political career. We need to understand the Munich Agreement too. It was a so-called peace treaty that handed over Czechoslovakia to Hitler. It was the West begging Hitler for peace. So why is the Munich Agreement important? In books about US foreign policy after World War II, the phrase Munich Syndrome appears frequently. Fear of another Munich is why they entered the Korean War. Same with the Vietnam War, it was driven by the fear of appeasement. Anyway, let's explain the plan that Keynes proposed to Chancellor Chamberlain. Keynes's plan was for the US to lend money to Germany. Yes, another loan from the US. Yeah, they've treated you terribly. You could use this loan to repay France. Just pay it off and be done with it. Then France repays Britain and Britain repays the US. So the money ends up right back in America. When Keynes laid out this idea to Chamberlain, Chamberlain said, "You're a genius," and passed it along to the Wilson administration. Did they say, "What a great idea"? Of course not. They rejected it outright. Are you trying to play games with our money? If you were America, would you go along with that? You lend to Germany and maybe one day they'll repay, but who knows when. Then they pay France and Britain. And they pay you, the money comes full circle. What's the problem? That was Keynes's idea. Britain's Chancellor Chamberlain proposed it to the US, but the Wilson administration said no. We learn about Wilson as an idealist, right? But did he act like an idealist? That's the dilemma of idealism. Its biggest challenge, there's a limit to how far you can go. Idealism assumes the other side is just as well-intentioned. But what if the other side isn't? What if they're cunning like Keynes? Oh wow, so money leaves our pocket, makes a round and clears all debts. And all we have to do is wait 50 years for Germany to pay us back? But guess what? That exact idea. After World War II, America realized this beats another war. Keynes's idea became the Marshall Plan. So how did Britain repay its debt in 2006? They used US funds to develop their economy and paid back the debt with that. Simply put, this is the biggest difference between the US and China. In the Marshall Plan, the US gave money, but didn't say, use our cement, hire our construction firms. They didn't attach any such conditions. The plan wasn't just financial aid, it was meant to restart entire economies. It was about helping nations grow their own industries. That's what the Marshall Plan was. But as we discussed last time, China's Belt and Road is the opposite. They give loans to weak and unstable countries and then insist, use our companies, our workers, our engineers. Had Wilson acted this way after World War I, maybe World War II never would have happened. But America didn't do it back then. So did they get their money back? They lost all of it. The US got played. Except for Finland, every country defaulted on their World War I debt. It was deliberate. They all stiffed America together. Why did Finland repay? Because it bordered the Soviet Union. They had fought wars with the Soviets and lived under constant pressure. In many ways, it was like Ukraine today. So they thought, let's repay our debts to America and stay close with them. That way, if the Soviets threaten us, we can say, hey, we're tight with the US. Finland was the only one of 17 countries that repaid. The other 16 defaulted. Wouldn't it have been better to just forgive those debts up front? After World War II, the US finally realized this. Not immediately, but after a few years. That's what the Marshall Plan was. You can think of the Marshall Plan as Keynes's World War I idea finally put into action after World War II. So economists debate whether we're Keynesian or not. But the truth is, modern civilization owes a huge debt to Keynes. Everyone living in today's financial system is shaped by his thinking. Not just his economics, but his political ideas, his worldview. We owe a lot. After the war, Germany and France chose inflation. The US and UK chose deflation. Germany just kept inflating. France inflated at first, then returned to the gold standard to stabilize. The US resumed gold convertibility right after World War I ended in 1919. Britain, under US pressure or guidance, returned to gold and got wrecked. We remember this, deflation. They suffered a brutal economic downturn. France ignored the US and delayed the gold standard, then devalued before returning. Germany essentially committed national suicide. We talked about the Treaty of Versailles last time. They lost territory, overseas colonies, and were crushed with reparations. The reparation bill was about 5 times Germany's pre-war GDP. But more than money, it wounded their national psyche. You alone are to blame for the war. Now, there's a key difference between World War I and World War II. World War II had Hitler and the genocide of the Jews. So the label war criminal made sense. Those were real crimes. But World War I, that was more of a typical power struggle. It wasn't clear who committed crimes. It was just war, a war of empires. But it left a deep scar on Germany, and one corporal took it especially personally. A man humiliated to his core. He vowed to spend his life avenging that disgrace. His name? Adolf Hitler. So what exactly was Germany's economic suicide? Let's take a look. This is what we call a logarithmic scale. It doesn't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It goes 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1 million, and so on. The bottom axis isn't logarithmic. It just shows the years. This chart tracks Germany's mark against gold, specifically the face value of the mark versus gold. Over 5 years, it jumps 12 points on a log scale. That's 10 to the 12th power. We're in fantastical territory now. This was his doing. Rudolf Havenstein. He refused to listen. He was obsessed with the printing press. He seemed to believe printing more money would solve everything. He kept printing until the day he died. Then came Hjalmar Schacht, who succeeded him as Reichsbank president. He stopped the madness by tying the mark to land value. Havenstein died in 1923 alongside the German mark. Germany is a strange place. Even after all that, they didn't fire him. Here's how law-abiding Germans are. After World War I, there was a revolution. Kaiser Wilhelm II fled to the Netherlands. There were protests in the streets, and here's a scene described in books, where a 90-degree street corner had a patch of grass. A sign said, "Please keep off the grass." So the protesting crowd walked around it. No one stepped on the grass. That's the German temperament. Even in disaster, the government was too rule-bound to fire him. He died, thankfully, and that's when it stopped. It had gone way too far. You'd think they'd stop earlier, but no, it got extreme. So what happened because of this? The entire public debt was wiped out. That's today's main point. Now we circle back to Bitcoin. So when governments deal with public debt refers to liabilities of national or local governments. We need to watch China very closely now. China, too, has a huge pile of public debt. There are 3 ways to get rid of it. 1, grow the economy and pay off interest and principal. If the economy grows, tax revenues increase, so you can pay both interest and principal more easily. 2, inflate your way out. 3, default, raise your hands and say, "I can't pay." Britain's debt after the Napoleonic Wars reached 260% of GDP. That was the late 18th to early 19th century. It took them 40 years to bring it down to 100%, 40 years to reduce public debt to GDP level. But after World War II, it took Britain only 20 years to do the same. They cut it in half. Many scholars, and I was taught this too, say that after World War II, the orange line represents advanced Western economies. This is the public debt to GDP ratio for advanced Western economies. 100% means the national debt equals the size of the economy. You can see it shoots up during World War II. Then it steadily declines until the 1980s. And now this is where we are. So what's today's public debt level in the West relative to GDP? We just fought a war, COVID, a financial war. We're back to World War II level debt. This is where we stand. During that period, the global economy grew tremendously. Economic growth helped reduce the debt to GDP ratio. The common narrative is that fiscal discipline improved. But according to a 2011 IMF report, IMF researchers didn't exactly see it that way. The US is a prime example. Let's look at America's debt to GDP ratio. It spikes steeply during World War II, then drops just as steeply. It falls to around 30% by the 1970s. Then it rises again, drops again. 2008, that was nothing. It seemed big, but compared to COVID, it's trivial. And this is where things get tricky. We start asking, what is Powell doing now? If the Fed raises interest rates, does the US government's interest burden rise or fall? Does it pay more on its debt or less? It rises, it increases. According to the IMF, if we zoom out from 1945 to 2009, the real interest rate was mostly negative before the 1980s and mostly positive after. The real interest rate is the nominal rate minus inflation. That means if I borrow money at 10% and inflation is 10%, in simple terms, though it's more complex, the real rate is 0%. If inflation is 11%, the real rate is negative 1%. In that case, the borrower actually gains from inflation. See where this is going now? From the end of World War II until the 1980s, real rates were often negative. There were positives, but negatives dominated. That's how public debt ratios shrank. If you plot it like a normal distribution, 1945 to 1980 shows a median above 0, but skewed negative. 0 is right here on the axis. From 1981 to 2010, it shifts mostly to the positive side. From 1,880 to 1,939, it's widely dispersed with no clear pattern. This is what happened globally between 1945 and the 1980s. IMF researchers analyzed it by country, and let's look at a few key examples. In the UK, from 1945 to 1980, real interest rates were negative 47% of the time, meaning lenders got screwed. If you lent money, you lost value. Those were the years of negative real returns. In the US, it was 25%, and Ireland was worse, 62%. Earlier, we talked about the 3 ways to eliminate public debt. 1, grow the economy. 2, inflate. 3, default. Latin America chose option 3 in the 1980s. They defaulted. Why did they default then? In the 1970s, they couldn't handle high oil prices. Surprisingly, Latin American governments responded with populist policies. Japan and South Korea worked their way through the crisis, but Latin governments just threw subsidies around to avoid lowering living standards. Then in the 1980s, Mexico collapsed and others followed. Their debt back then was $300 billion, equivalent to $800 billion today. Private banks took the hit. Citibank alone wrote off $5 billion in losses. Before the Latin debt crisis, people believed that short of war, nations didn't go bankrupt. We talk about countries failing, but what does that really mean? Usually we think of war or total collapse, like everything just falling apart. But here a country simply says, I can't pay my debt. And when that happened, everyone who had lent money, people, banks, investors, panicked. How do we get our money back? What do you even do? Think about this seriously. It's no small matter. You're never taught this in school. If I borrow money from you and disappear, then what? Do you just say, well, bad luck? No, you'd investigate, track me down, right? And you'd rely on the legal system. But what if a whole country defaults? What's Citibank supposed to do? Go cry to the UN. Mexico isn't paying. That's serious. It's a massive structural problem. Under imperialism, this doesn't happen. Why not? Remember what we discussed before. Britain deployed its navy for exactly this reason. They had money spread all across the world. If a country defaulted, the Royal Navy showed up. That's imperialism. Not flags, but financial enforcement. But the US claims it doesn't do empire. Yet Citi and other affected banks are American. It's a headache. Which means not doing empire is actually very difficult. Because countries collapse, they just default. So what do? Democratic idealists, please answer that. What should we do when nations say they can't repay their debts? Anyone educated in democratic values in Korea would probably say, be sincere, work hard, and communicate openly. That's why democratic platitudes feel so naive in finance. They misunderstand how the world actually works. This is the reality we face. Even the US finds it troubling. Wait, aren't nations not supposed to go bankrupt? Sovereigns don't default, that's the theory, because there's no court that can sue sovereign power. If we're not an empire, are we supposed to send tanks to collect debts, battleships? What do we even seize? Repossession means forceful control, which means military power. But enforcing property with military power, that's imperialism. And we said we don't do that. It's a messy contradiction. Let's rethink what we mean by imperialism. When this kind of thing happens, your country ends up like Latin America. In other words, Latin American nations are no longer considered safe for LIBOR-based lenders. So they have to go through multiple layers to get funding. Normally, sovereign states are at the first level of credit access. Banks would borrow at LIBOR and lend to Latin America because their credit was strong then, but then they got downgraded to the second tier. Those top-tier lenders stopped lending to them. Now it's only second-tier institutions that still lend using LIBOR, but what if they default again? Even the second tier shuts the door. Then they drop to tier 3. Now the country has to borrow from payday lenders, Russian cash style. A sovereign nation forced to rely on subprime lenders. People don't realize how fragile democracy is until you apply it to finance. I guarantee you, there won't be a single Democrat left, not one. Not in here, not out there. Once it's your money, egalitarianism evaporates. When it's public money, maybe some will remain. But even with public money, no one truly believes everyone deserves the same interest rate. If anyone still claims to be egalitarian, tell them, lend your own money that way. They never will, guaranteed. So why bring up social hierarchy? Let me explain. It's a hard, uncomfortable question. We no longer have slavery, technically. I'm not talking about slave treatment. I mean the institution itself. Slavery means a human being is property, transferable. Let's say you work at Samsung and LG wants to hire you. A headhunter calls and makes you an offer. What do? You inform Samsung and switch jobs. That's it. Does Samsung send goons after you? Of course not. But in slavery, mobility is impossible. If LG wants you, they have to negotiate with Samsung, not you. So first, LG has to pay Samsung to buy you. Whether you, the asset, get compensated or not, is what separates slavery from the Premier League. Slaves aren't Sun Hung Min, so you just deal with the owner and transfer them. The Premier League is structurally similar, but they also pay Sun and sign a contract. If you want to understand modern slavery, just look at American sports or European football. Can Son Heung-min go skiing during winter break? Of course not. Who owns that body? It belongs to Tottenham. He can't. What if he breaks his leg on the slopes? He's a well-treated slave and we all kind of want to be him. It was the same for popular gladiators in ancient Rome. In a slave system, you don't get credit defaults. That's a problem unique to democracy. Under slavery, if I maxed out my card and couldn't pay, you could sell the last thing you own yourself. But democracy doesn't allow that, at least not in any formal or legal way. That creates a problem for finance. Because at the end of the day, when someone defaults, the core issue is, how do you force repayment? If you're an empire, you seize land or strip sovereignty, you say, we take your collateral, you lose your sovereignty. Maybe you're better off without freedom. You could do that, but if you're not doing empire, it's a real headache. That's why Latin America has remained Latin America. Same credit status. They keep defaulting in cycles. A credit defaulter stays a defaulter. And for liberals, I'm a libertarian, or used to be. Not anymore, but I used to be one. This is a serious dilemma for libertarians. A radical libertarian might even support slavery in that limited sense. If you have nothing left to sell, shouldn't you be able to sell yourself? But slavery isn't just a contract to give up your body, it's something else. In some ways, slavery works very differently. In Joseon-era Korea, commoners starved during droughts, but slaves didn't. Why not? Because they were assets. Why would a rich man let his asset die? People didn't usually keep slaves just to abuse them. Sure, they were sadists, but they were still capital assets. Say you own a racehorse worth $100,000. So who gets better food, you or the horse? Answer honestly. Who eats the premium steak? You or the horse? I'm 100% sure. It's the horse. Horses don't eat steak, but you get the point. They consume far more valuable feed. Think about how well Tottenham treats Son Heung-min. He's a premium asset. Once we enter the world of finance, libertarians who reject slavery and empire face a major philosophical problem. It's also rooted in Christian ethics. The abolition of slavery itself was a Christian idea. Without Christianity, that idea doesn't even exist. For most Homo sapiens in history, that was as far as their ethics went. They believed slavery was the more rational system. Now, you mess up, pay with your body, bankruptcy, that's where their logic stopped. Think about it. It kind of makes sense. So where does Christian thinking intervene? Okay, now this turns into a sermon. Let's talk grace. In Christianity, there are two key ideas, law and grace. Law and grace. This isn't a joke. It's deeply serious. The law says if you sin, you lose a finger or a foot or an eye, no mercy. If we actually applied it, we'd all be blind or maimed. Everyone would be damaged. So then we must turn to grace. Grace means you're forgiven, but it's not free. Someone pays on your behalf. In Christianity, that someone is Jesus. I paid your debt for you. That's substitutionary atonement. But isn't grace problematic too? Look at Latin America. Did they learn from being forgiven? Or did they think they'll forgive us again anyway? Isn't that a huge dilemma? One of America's strengths is that it's the most bankruptcy-friendly country in the world. Korea's bankruptcy law is modeled on the US, which promotes it actively. Historically, Korea was very conservative about this. Culturally, we believed if you owe it, you pay it. Old Korean dramas always showed bankruptcy with red seizure notices on doors. In Korea, when something goes wrong, we expect infinite accountability. It's an extremely morally strict society. But being moralistic isn't the same as having true moral reasoning. A country with such high moral standards allows personal bankruptcy. It doesn't fit our traditional sense of justice. But we adopted American-style bankruptcy laws. In some US states, it's absurdly easy to go bankrupt. Sometimes they even recommend it, just declare bankruptcy. Bankruptcy basically means I can't repay, just like Latin America. I can't pay, do what you want. You can't enslave them, so you forgive the debt. Then you go to debt restructuring and say, at least pay something. You owe $1 million, just repay $100,000. We creditors have agreed. You can do that, right? Repay it over 10 years. 99% of Americans abuse this law. That's not good. But that 1%, they use bankruptcy to rise again, to build Hilton hotels and more. I've forgotten most of their names, but every major entrepreneur you know has filed for bankruptcy at least once. Even if they didn't go bankrupt, they knew they could fail without risking their family's freedom. This went a bit off topic. But strictly speaking, law is right? You owe it, you pay it. That's the rule. But if we apply law relentlessly, we'll all be missing eyes or limbs. There's no room for a second chance. So grace is the answer, but what happens when you apply grace? Everyone becomes irresponsible. What do we do? Here's my answer. You'll have to carry this contradiction with you for the rest of your life. You'll never escape it, because we are hybrid beings, spiritually idealistic, physically animalistic. Feels weird to pivot from geopolitics to theology, right? But it's all connected, isn't it? That's all for today. So what's the takeaway? Why didn't the US enter World War I sooner? Why do I, Otemin, believe America stayed out? It wasn't ignorance. History suggests maybe they didn't know, but I don't think that was it. What if the US had done after World War I what it later did after World War II? Could Hitler have been prevented from rising to power if that had happened? Like Keynes suggested, if the US had lent money to Germany, saying, use this to repay France and Britain, and then helped Germany grow its economy so it could repay those loans. At the time, the debt was 5 times Germany's GDP, but with growth, it could shrink to just 10%. Then Germany could say, here, America, take your payment. Britain, for example, repaid its World War II debt in full only in 2006. So why didn't they take that route after World War I? Hint, it has everything to do with what I just preached about earlier. The US was already a great power back then, but not yet overwhelming. After World War II, however, it stood absolutely dominant because every other power had collapsed. This global trade order we enjoy exists because the US commands unmatched naval power. Not because its navy is better, but because, in geopolitical terms, this system only works when no one else has serious naval power. After World War I, the US was powerful, but Britain and France were still great powers too, so America wasn't willing to play the sucker. It's instinctual, really. The US didn't want World War II to happen, but when Europe collapsed, America could finally act on its ideals. Let's show grace, let's forgive them all. We'll discuss this in detail later through the Bretton Woods system, which was a monumental framework in human history. The victors could have taken a very different path, but instead, an unusually generous victor emerged and forgave everyone. Do you think a system like that lasts forever? It has an expiration date, guaranteed. Once we stop believing nations can't default, finance begins to unravel. That's why non-imperial finance, like credit without slavery, keeps getting cyclical fevers. Democracy and finance don't mesh well. That's why we get financial crises again and again. Systems crash, then recover, then crash again. Yet a small 1% rise from the ashes each time, inventing, innovating, driving the economy forward. So we can't say the system is all wrong. It's a contradiction. Law and grace. We'll continue next time.